Hello everybody, we're looking at global illumination for mobile devices, which means for slow GPUs and slow graphics hardware. A friend of mine was producing a game for mobile and asked me to find the best looking lighting solution for a scene in which he had only a few moving objects and the rest of the scene was static, and he wanted something that looks as good as possible, which usually means you will have to employ some form of global illumination, which cannot be real time for obvious reasons on slow hardware. So we cannot afford to recompute global illumination on every frame, so we need to pre-bake it and pre-compute as much as we can. Thankfully, Unity has a couple of options there. They're just not very well documented, so I want to share with you the technique that I found out for us, and that will hopefully work for you as well. What I've prepared here is a quick demo scene with really just a few blocks to represent a simple room. And we have our Ethan character here, which is like a standard prefab that you can download from the Unity store. I think it even comes automatically with the Unity installation. You just have to import the asset, and this is going to stand in for our dynamically lit geometry that's also supposed to cast dynamic shadows on our static world geometry. Other than that, this scene is very much standard, or as it comes out of the box. When you open a new scene, all you have is a skybox and a directional light, just like this one. I didn't change any of the settings in here. This is the default scene, except for the few objects that I mentioned earlier. You can tell that there's still the original color set here. It's still set to directional, but we need to change the mode from real-time to mixed. And mixed means that this light is going to be taken into account both in real-time lighting and baked lighting. So this is the only thing that we need to change on the sun, and we can switch over to the lighting tab. By the way, if you can't see the lighting tab in your session, maybe you closed it by accident or on purpose, you can get it back by clicking on the Windows menu, going down to lighting, clicking settings, and there you are your lighting settings. And what I usually do is just drag it back up here to its default position, and here we go. In environment, you can leave everything at default. I'm going to close this down. Real-time lighting, we don't want real-time global illumination unless you're sure you can afford it on your hardware, but then this tutorial is not for you. For the sake of this one, I'm going to turn it off because we want a really fast rendering solution. Mixed lighting, we want global illumination baked, so this is ticked on by default, and we're going to leave it ticked on. For the lighting mode, we're going to look at shadow mask towards the end of this presentation, but the majority of the presentation will discuss subtractive lighting. Real-time shadow color we're going to leave at its default. And that leads us finally to the light mapping settings, which are the quality settings for the texture baking process. If you have noticed, we have a fairly new version of Unity installed. This is version 2017.2. something, which already comes with the new progressive light mapper, which is still in preview state. It already works to some extent. Let me quickly switch to it. You can see that it comes with some exceptions that say that shadow mask and distance shadow mask modes are not supported in this preview version, which is not alarming because we want to use the subtractive mode anyway and not shadow mask. But I also found out during preparations that the old Enlighten shadow or light map baker is, at least for simple scenes, quite a lot faster and gives decent results as well. So we're just going to use this one for this particular example. And in order to get results quickly and not to bore you with long render times, I'm going to change the light map size from 1024 pixels down to 512. For better light map quality, I usually turn compressed light maps off unless you're running into memory problems on your hardware. Then you might want to either reduce the light map size some more or compress the light maps, which can give some artifacts in some locations, but depending on how strong your textures are, you probably wouldn't even see that. But in our particular example, everything is so monochromatic that you see every small error, so I'm going to leave it off. Ambient occlusion is something I'm not a big fan of, but it does help to get some more definition in little creases and along edges in such scenes in particular, so I'm turning it on. It's not going to slow down the rendering a lot, so I'm just going to leave that. Final gathering is something that will help you to clean up global illumination in especially darker areas, which we don't have here. It comes with a time penalty, not with the real-time rendering penalty, but for the sake of this presentation I'm going to leave it off. Directional mode is also interesting if you include that directional information in your light maps. However, it's going to cost more memory, and we want a solution that is really cheap to render, so we're going to turn this off. Light map parameters, I'm going to leave at default medium quality settings, and as you can see, auto generate is turned on by default, yet nothing's happening. Shouldn't we see baked light maps already? The reason the thing is not automatically starting to render is because none of the objects in this scene are by default eligible for light map baking and rendering. And the reason for that is that by default only static objects are included in the light map baking process. So in other words, all the objects that we want to be baked into light maps, we need to declare as static, and the best way to do this is to just use the root object of the room, set it to static, and I'll be asked if I want to change all the child objects as well, and I'm choosing yes. And that very moment the light map baker has realized that it has something to do, and immediately created the light maps for me. And you can tell from moving such a static object that the light map is completely static. It won't update, which is one of the drawbacks, of course, but the whole point of this is to have a very cheap yet good looking static environment, so you probably don't want to move things around anyway. As you can see, the only object that we did not declare as static is still dynamic and is still casting real-time shadows, including on our static and baked objects. That works in front here as well. But you can also tell immediately that there is a drawback to this. When we move our character into shadow, it is still being lit. Simply, static objects that are being light mapped and light map baked are not casting any real-time shadows, neither on static nor on dynamically lit geometry. So in order to do that, we need to add what Unity calls light probes, or a light probe group, which is represented by these little yellow light probes, which sample the lighting condition at a particular point in space in the scene. And unfortunately the process is manual, so it means that we will have to distribute these light probes in the scene. I'll just quickly do it manually just by selecting and duplicating, Control D again and again, just building up a raster of these light probes. And leave the editing mode, go back to lighting, and have it hopefully auto-generate. I'm not sure if it's already done. It might actually be that quick. Yeah, and I think that worked. You can tell from the lighting on the character, especially when I start moving it towards the light probe down here on that's down here on the floor. That this light probe is now emitting light onto the backside of the character, though it's not as intense as you would expect it from such a for example from the red color of the sphere. So what we would need to do also in order to get or capture the indirect lighting in the scene on dynamically lit objects a little bit better is to adjust these light probes so they represent the lighting situation in a closer way, let's put it that way. So for example, when I move this into shadow, you can tell it's getting a bit darker, but not as quickly and as dark as you would expect. And the reason for that is that this character is now lit by this light probe and probably by this light probe, and they both recorded the lighting situation at these points and are illuminating only dynamic objects now with this particular lighting information. But you can see that the distance between these two light probes is pretty large, which is why you're only seeing a very slow change from something that is lit to something that is in shadow. So in order to represent this a little bit better, we need to go back into the light group and move light probes in such a way that they represent the change in the lighting situation a bit more accurately by placing some of the probes directly into the light and some of the probes directly into the shadow. Now, of course, this is quite a labor-intensive process, and imagine this is just a very simple scene. But imagine if you have a big scene, you will be, you will need to spend a considerable amount of time placing these light probes in such a way that they accurately replicate the light changes that you would expect while moving a character through such a scene. Just trying to move my light probes around the red sphere a little bit more accurately. Let's create some more back here so that it would also have some effect when the character was standing on the other side, maybe like so. I think we're close enough. And it bakes and bakes and bakes and updates. Let's wait until it's done. And now if we leave the editing mode, go back to our character and move him around, you can tell that he's getting dark a lot quicker than he was before. What you're still not getting, of course, is a pronounced shadow on the character. That is simply not possible or not easily possible with this particular technique, no matter how many light probes you're placing. So don't even try to get a sharp shadow out of it, it won't work. The algorithm always just takes the closest probes, so there is always very sparse information about the lighting in the scene, but still you're getting global illumination almost for free, and even some dynamic global illumination on your dynamic characters. I think for a mobile device this is pretty cool. The only other thing that you can do that is not quite as cheap but might still work on your mobile device is to use not subtractive mode but shadow mask mode, which I mentioned earlier. Let's quickly look at that one as well. So if we switch to shadow mask and wait for the baking to be finished, you can see that now all the objects in your scene are casting very sharp shadows, real-time shadows. Even our character, if I move him over here, you can see that he's receiving shadows in a very accurate and sharp way. So that is a lot better. However, it is also more expensive to render, not necessarily in such a simple scene, but imagine your environment consists of a lot of polygons. The shadow map that needs to be rendered at every frame, or the shadow map rendering for every frame, will become slower and slower, and it might become just too slow for your hardware. So this is really the trade-off. You get more accurate real-time lighting at the expense of slower render times. Of course, there are ways to improve this. For example, for objects that are always in the shadow, like this pillar, for example, you could tell this pillar to not cast shadows and even to not receive shadows, because if I've turned this off, you will see that there is very little difference in the visual appearance in the scene now. Yeah, it's losing some global illumination definition, of course, but this object won't cast any shadows and is therefore very cheap to render. It won't receive any shadows either. So there is ways to optimize this, of course, in such a way that only those objects that really need to cast shadows and receive shadows can be flagged as such, and all the other objects can be turned off, which in turn saves render time, of course. That's pretty much it. To reiterate, if you want to reproduce this, make sure that on your directional light you've set it to mixed mode. In your lighting settings, make sure that you are using either shadow mask if you can afford it and you want accurate real-time shadows on your character. If you can't afford it, go to the cheapest mode and use subtractive, and accept that your character won't receive accurate real-time shadows. One last thing, you might encounter scenes where your real-time shadow is just a little bit too dark. This is especially obvious when you go to, for example, higher indirect intensity levels than 1, which is not physically accurate, but it can help, especially with the old Enlighten Light Map Baker, to brighten up some very dark areas a little bit. For example, if I set this to 2 and I move my character, you can tell that due to the additional energy or light energy in the scene, everything is becoming a little bit brighter, and then the shadow looks a bit strange, because shadows on shadow don't look very realistic. In this particular case, you might want to go into the real-time shadow color and adjust it a little bit up until the point where it becomes invisible in shadows. Now if you move your character back, it still has very pronounced shadow in the bright areas, but it works a lot better with your areas that are already in shadow. Optimizations can still be done on a per object level basis. So for example, very high polygonal objects, especially the ones that are always in shadow, you can go and just turn off shadow casting and shadow receiving, or a combination thereof, to save some additional render time. Hope you found this useful. Happy light map baking.